Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our Mightybytes third webinar of the year. Our topic today is digital accessibility. I'm Nicole. I will be serving as the moderator for today, for the chat mostly. If we can get the next slide. So really quickly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Mightybytes and who we are. Mightybytes is a digital agency located in Chicago. We help our clients meet businesses and marketing goals to drive long-term sustainable growth. And Mightybytes has been around since 1998. Next slide.
Thanks, Nicole.
And on the panel today, we have some wonderful people here to talk to you. We have Emily Ladau, a disability rights activist. We have Veronica, a product manager at Mightybytes, and Tim Frick, president of Mightybytes. And I'm Nicole, in case you forgot.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi. So really quickly, we have our agenda up here so you can know what we're going to go through. And we're using closed captioning today in order to enable that. You can select that from your bottom window. It'll say
live transcript,
and you can just click enable that and it should work for you. But if you have any questions, you can put that in the chat and I'll type a response to you. If you have any questions that come up during the presentation, you can ask them using the Q&A feature. We'll be stopping after each of these sections in order to ask a couple of questions. And if yours doesn't get asked, don't worry. We're going to have a moment at the end of the presentation and we can ask any questions that got passed over during the presentation. So yeah, I think that's it. We're ready to get rolling.
All right. Thanks, Nicole. Appreciate it. Emily, first of all, thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time. Emily's been a great past client of ours, and has worked with us on a project that she and Veronica are going to talk about a little bit more. I just wanted to ask a few kind of high-level questions and then maybe talk a bit about your book, if that's okay.
Sounds good. I'm really happy to be here.
Excellent. I'm so glad. So tell me a little bit about how events in the last year with COVID-19 and everything have changed for people with disabilities.
That's a great question. And I also just want to make sure that I come from a place of noting that while I do identify as somebody who has a disability, I have a physical disability, I recognize that I also come from a place of a lot of privilege when it comes to being a white woman, when it comes to class privilege. You know, I've been relatively safe and protected throughout this entire time. But that being said, the global disability population has been at significantly greater risk when it comes to the pandemic. We've always had significant disparities in pretty much every area, you know, whether it's healthcare, whether it's employment, education, social safety nets. But the pandemic really brought to light the fact that, you know, disabled people are a much more vulnerable population. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were conversations quite literally about if the lives of people with disabilities were worth saving, if it came down to needing to choose who would receive a ventilator, it was, should we save the person with a disability or should we save the person without the disability? And, you know, there was guidance from the federal government around not rationing healthcare based on disability, because that simply is not ethical. But, you know, at these local hospital levels and things like that, those were very real conversations that people were having. So, you know, it was a really tumultuous time for the disability community in terms of basic survival, but then also just, you know, broader shifts in our culture and in the way that we were interacting with the world, and the big move to virtual platforms. So there was a lot of negatives, but I would say also for many disabled people, some positives in the virtual culture shift.
And when you say positives, can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, nobody wants to say that a pandemic is positive, and that's
Right.
certainly not the implication here. But I think it's also really important to talk about the fact that for many, going out and about simply wasn't as accessible, whether it was transportation related, whether it was health related. There were a whole host of access issues to actually being able to, leave the house for many people. And that's not the fault of the person with a disability. It's rather the way that society was built. And so when we have a greater shift towards, okay, if working virtually works for you, that's what we're going to do. This is a positive thing for society. Of course, our hands were forced at the
Right.
beginning, but now I think this stands to be a more permanent change. And that brings up access issues of its own, because people with disabilities need captioning, and they need platforms that work with screen readers, and they need access to large print materials, and they need time for breaks and flexibility, right? So, the access issues are never going to be perfect. There's always going to be a balance, but on the whole, the virtual world has really opened up a lot of potential for a lot of people.
That's great. And so with millions of people getting vaccinated, there's kind of the hope that COVID is going to wind down, or at least, change in terms of the way that we deal with it on a daily basis. But we've got, a lot of other big wicked problems looming on the horizon, like climate change and a bunch of other things. What are your thoughts on like how we might build resilience, kind of socially and culturally, so that we can ensure the disability community's needs are met as we start, thinking about the next potential disruption?
It's a great question. And I think that the biggest way to ensure that we are making everything that we do more accessible to the disability community is having people with disabilities at every table where every conversation is happening. I would be utterly remiss if I didn't actually make a plug for something called the Disability and Philanthropy webinar series, which I feel like would answer the questions much better than I can. And I'm going to drop the link in the chat.
Right,
So we'll be
thanks.
talking about health equity next month. We've already talked about racial equity. We're going to be talking about climate change. And we're going to also be talking about gender and sexuality, all through a disability lens. And the reason that I point to that is because I want to, as I was saying before, acknowledge that I come from a particular place of privilege where I may not have, the most thorough and insightful perspective on all of these topics. And so being able to hear and learn from disabled people who are doing the work on these specific issues is
Mhm.
the crucial way to learn. If I could give one piece of advice always, it would be have people with disabilities at the table.
Yeah, it's really, really critical. So are there, given that, what would be the best way for people to be an ally towards this and make sure that you said having people with disabilities at the table. How can those without disabilities, be allies and be supportive as supportive as they possibly can in this?
I think the important thing to remember is that ally is not a title that we can just bestow upon
Right,
ourselves. Ally is really a verb. It requires action, it requires commitment, and it's not something that you can say that you are an ally and then you are. It's something that you just commit to doing the work, continue to do the best that you can, recognize that you're going to make mistakes, but necessarily, or not necessarily, I should say, going around simply declaring yourself an
right.
ally, right? Ally is something that you do, it's not something that you are. And in terms of being the best possible ally to the disability community, it's about knowing when to pass the mic to people with disabilities. It's about knowing when to step back and amplify the voices of disabled people. And most importantly, it's about making sure that any table where there's a conversation is accessible to disabled people. And if it's not, if you're not asking yourself who's missing, you're not really doing your job as an ally. And so the first question is always to say, how can I be a better ally who's missing, how can I ensure they're part of the conversation?
Yeah, that's great. And that actually brings me to our next topic, which is your new book, Demystifying Disability, What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally. So tell me when this book comes out.
This old thing. Yes, it comes out on September 7th.
That's awesome. And who should read it?
I want to say everybody, but that answer is probably a bit too broad. So I've given it a lot of thought, and I realized that it can be a guide for people with disabilities, people without disabilities. It can be a guide for people who work, especially in the education sector. It can be a guide for people who work with people with disabilities in any capacity. So if you're a human resources person, if you're an employer, if you're a teacher, right? If you work in the accessibility sector and you're supporting people with disabilities to better navigate the internet, it also really helps to understand how you can best support, engage, interact with the disability community. And so this book is really meant to be a 101 for anybody who has questions, isn't really sure about the right thing to say, may be hesitant to engage with people with disabilities simply because they're worried they're going to get it wrong. And this is a starting point and a safe space to get some of those questions answered and to find out how you can start the conversations that you need to have to be a better ally to the disability community.
That's great. And is there a specific place that anybody can go to pick this book up?
Yeah, it's available online right now, wherever your favorite bookstore is. I really encourage buying local
Yeah.
or purchasing from IndieBound or Bookshop, but it is also available on Amazon and through the Penguin Random House publisher website. I'm happy to drop a link in the chat to that as well. But I'm
Great.
super excited to be able to start engaging with people around this and to let everyone know that this is not where the conversation ends. It's really where the conversation begins.
Yeah.
I'm not the authority or the expert on disability. I'm just one disabled person. And I always say that if you've met one person with a disability, then you've met one person with a disability.
Right.
So I hope this book is the introduction that people need to become more comfortable with being the best ally that they can be.
And if I might pull back the curtain a little bit, what inspired you to write the book, and how long did it take?
So I would say that I was inspired because I have a bit of a mantra, if you will, that if you want the world to be accessible to the disability community, then let's make the disability experience more accessible and understandable and relatable to the world. And I recognize that's not always a popular line of thought, especially among disabled people who feel like they don't want to be a teachable moment. And I totally get that. I wish that we lived in a world where the burden and the onus wasn't always on the disability community to do the educating. But I think that right now we're at this critical juncture where if we don't find ways to meet each other where we're at and to have these open dialogues, then we're not going to make the progress that we want to see. And so I have used this book as sort of a springboard to continue to have these conversations with people. And it took me, I would say, a little less than a year to write, start to finish, but it's been a lengthy process of lots of work behind the scenes to get it just
Sure.
right. And so I am excited for it to soon be coming out into the world.
That's excellent. Well, congratulations. Really,
Thank
really,
you.
that's wonderful, wonderful news. We're going to move quick, like if anybody has any questions, as Nicole was saying earlier, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We're going to kind of be, the next two sections are going to be presentation, but we want to break at any time given a natural, if there's natural opportunity for having a discussion. So as we go through this section and the section that follows, If you're not presenting, feel free and have some questions to drop in or want to have further this discussion, please jump in for sure. So the next section we're going to talk about is accessibility in the changing world. And specifically, we're talking around, oops, am I going the wrong way? There we go. There, Digital Accessibility 101. And Veronica, my colleague, is going to give a breakdown of what that is and how we approach it at Mightybytes as a digital agency. So.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. I think Emily's discussion there has been a really good introduction to what I'm about to talk about, which is digital accessibility or web accessibility. Because what Emily touched on was this idea of bringing the disability community to the table. So allowing them to participate. I shouldn't even say allow, bringing them and encouraging that participation with the disability community. So that happens in person, but it also happens online. And a lot of people forget that there are millions of people out there with lots of different types of disabilities that need to have special devices that will allow them to access the content on the website. And it's important that when we're setting up our websites that we're considering these devices so that regardless of someone's disability, they can still access our content and engage with it. So for example, if somebody is blind, they won't be able to see your website. And so the navigation won't be visible to them and they won't know where to click or what buttons to push because they won't be able to see those. So they'll use something called a screen reader, which will read aloud the content on the site, and they'll be able to tab through different sections to sort of jump through the navigation or through the content to click where they need to click. Now, they can only do that if your website is built in such a way that it will accommodate a screen reader and its functionality. Similarly, if somebody is deaf, they won't be able to hear a video or listen to an audio file. So they will rely on closed captioning or transcripts in order to access that content. And if somebody has a disability that prevents them from moving their hands or their arms, they may not be able to use a keyboard or a mouse to navigate your site. So they'll have another piece of technology that may track eye movement or maybe is voice activated to use their cursor on your site. So when we're building websites and when we are designing them, we have to bear in mind that we're not just doing it for a desktop or a tablet or a mobile, but we're also doing these, building these websites for other devices known as this assistive technology. Now, the interesting thing and the really useful thing to know about is that there is not a global law that sort of says, these are the things you have to do to make your website accessible. But there are a set of standards written by the World Wide Web Consortium, and they are called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or the WCAG. And they set out, I think there's currently 50 guidelines on how to create an accessible website. Currently, we're on version 2.1 of the WCAG, but I believe most countries and most laws currently look to 2.0 as the thing to follow. We always recommend that you work with the latest version. So even if a law states that you should follow 2.0, really you should want to follow version 2.1 as that's the most current version. Now, these guidelines are really the gold standard, and they cover a range of topics that I'll dig into a little bit deeper. But really, they help to define the things you should do as a designer, a developer, or a content manager to make your site more accessible. If we can jump to the next slide, this shows you that there are 3 levels of accessibility within these guidelines, within the WCAG. And those are AA, and AAA. So when you talk about web accessibility, there isn't just a blanket statement of yes, I'm accessible or no, I'm not. There's actually different levels that you can adhere to. So if we could move to the next slide, please. I'll go through each of these and we'll start with A. So A is the most basic level of accessibility that you can have on your site. And it's because it's the most basic, it's the easiest to achieve. It focuses on the basics, making things easier to navigate and translating your site into a way that the technology, the assistive technology that's being used can access it. So when I say translate, I don't mean language. I mean, technically, that assistive technology is able to take whatever content is on the page and provide it to the user in a way that they can access. Now, A is better than nothing when it comes to accessibility, but it's certainly not the level that we would recommend. We can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So AA is typically the recommended level for website accessibility. It's the level that most governments will require, and it's the level that even the World Wide Web Consortium recommends. And so if you're really going to start talking about web accessibility, you shouldn't go any lower than AA. And that should really be your starting point. Now, AA allows for a wider range of disabilities to access a website. And it starts to get into some of the more technical updates like color contrast and error identification. So we're really starting to get into more technical things, and you'll most likely get a developer involved at this stage. And then finally, we have AAA. Now, this is the highest level of accessibility currently in the guidelines. And at this point, you're really trying to make a website as accessible as possible for the widest range of people. Now, one of the reasons that this is not as recommended by laws or by even the World Wide Web Consortium is that it is more strict about things like color contrast and placement of clickable areas and that sort of thing. So what you'll find is that when you're making design decisions for your website, AAA may influence how things need to look or how they're structured. Now, I'll be honest, that sounds more intimidating than it really is. And actually what you'll find with AAA guidance is that it follows a lot of just general design best practices. So in reality, although you might have to make decisions that you may otherwise not have chosen, they are quite often just good usability in general. And one thing I want to point out with these different levels is that regardless of which level you choose, you'll really need to consider web accessibility as an ongoing practice, an ongoing activity, sort of like you would consider search engine optimization an ongoing activity. And that's because not only do you have to make sure that your code is up to scratch, and with technology changing and new browser updates and so on, that's always going to be something to consider. But you also need to make sure your content is accessible. So whenever you're publishing a new page or editing an existing page, you'll need to make sure that the content itself follows accessibility guidelines. Now, in terms of the guidelines themselves, they are broken up into 4 principles. And those principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And what you'll find is when you look at these guidelines, many of them actually exist in more than one principle. And all of these principles, again, they follow the idea of usability best practices anyway. So when you're looking through this list, which I encourage everyone to go onto the WCAG website and take a look at this, you'll see that they're nicely organized by these principles. So I'll dig a little bit into each of these, but really the details can be found on their website. So when it comes to perceivable, this is the notion that your content and your functionality needs to be perceived by all users. Now, notice it doesn't say that they can see it or that it's visible, Because if there is somebody who is blind or has some sort of vision issues, then they may not be able to see something, but they can still perceive it through their assistive technology. So perceivable guidelines could be something like including the alt text on an image or including closed caption on a video. So as long as people can perceive your content and functionality with whatever device they're using, then you'll be adhering to these guidelines. The next category is operable. And this is all about making sure that your website's navigation and functionality can be operated regardless of what device the person is using. So in this case, it's things like making sure that your website will allow for keyboard or trackpad control or touchscreen control as well. Making sure that the navigation can be tabbed through or using a mouse, but that whoever's using it can access your navigation and your sub-navigation. And those are just a few of the examples within operable. So the idea is your site can be operated regardless of device. The third principle is understandable. And within this are a couple of things. First, people need to be able to understand the content and also understand what is expected of them. So for example, if someone comes to your site, the guidelines will tell you to make sure that on your forms that you have instructional text attached to the form fields so that people understand what is expected in each of those fields. Similarly, if there's an error on the form, let's say someone puts an invalid email address, then they will see an error message that's clear and explains what the issue is. So we want clear and understandable content and functionality. And then finally, we have robust. And robust is all about making sure that your code is clean so that it's compatible across all devices as well. Because what we have to remember is not only are we building for desktop, tablet, mobile, all the browsers out there, but we're also building for all of these accessible technologies and their software, and those can have older versions as well. So we have to just try to consider this and make sure our code is as clean as can be so that it can be compatible with all these different devices. Now, I might pause here before we go into the case study, just to check if there's any questions at the moment. I know that I threw a lot at you.
I don't see anything in the Q&A yet, but
Okay.
Folks feel free to add anything as we're going through this.
Okay, well, I'll keep going and we can always answer questions. So I wanted to put in a small case study here, and this is actually a site that Mightybytes worked on with Emily. And this was for the Disability and Philanthropy Forum. And this site was commissioned by the President's Council, which is a group of, I believe, 17 foundations, philanthropic foundations. And the goal here was to help people working in philanthropy to understand how to consider and involve the disability community in their grant making. So this site has a lot of resources, and it has a public area as well as a member area. So our goal here was to create a AA accessible website. Remember, that's that mid-level accessibility. And we wanted this to serve as an example of good accessibility. And so we were able to create this site and the functionality needed. And we really thought about accessibility in the planning process, the design process, and the development process. And then at the end of all of that, we went through a testing process across multiple browsers and devices, but we also included assistive technology as well, working with the folks at Access Living in Chicago. Now, one of the things that we tried to do on this site was to purposefully include functionality that was meant to assist people with disabilities in terms of making the site more accessible, but it's also in there to educate all users on some of these accessibility features. So for example, At the top of the site, we have an accessibility controls dropdown so that users can change the font size. They can toggle to high contrast colors, and they can also use a text-to-speech function that will read the text out loud. Now, this isn't even necessarily for only people who have a disability. In many cases, someone who does not identify as having a disability will also benefit from these types of controls. Another thing that we included, and then you can see sort of in that bottom picture there, is the Able Player for videos. Able Player allows us to take a YouTube video and embed it into a site, but it adds additional accessibility controls. So for example, you have your standard closed captioning. If there is a transcript, that's made available, but it also allows the user to speed up or slow down the video, and there are a few other settings as well. So again, all of this can be used by anyone, not just someone with a disability, but they're purposefully there to make things more accessible and to help to educate that these features exist and they can become commonplace across all websites. Now, while we were doing this, while we were putting this site together, we started to realize that when you are focusing on accessibility, you may have to make certain decisions that could affect the accessibility of a different part of the site. So for example, when we added the text-to-speech function that reads aloud the content on the page, that actually caused conflict elsewhere on the site, which meant that other parts of the site didn't adhere to some of the WCAG guidelines. So we had to strike a balance here, and we had conversations about whether or not we should leave text-to-speech in or take it out. And the decision was made to leave it in because we felt like that would make a bigger impact to more people. And so I bring this up in total honesty and transparency, but also to say that when you're trying to achieve accessible websites, don't get disheartened if you don't get 100% perfect. You know, you're never going to build a website that is great for everyone. What you're trying to do is give as many people the best experience they can possibly have. And I think that's one of these lessons that people are still learning. And so every day, again, you've got to consider accessibility and web accessibility a continuous process. And that's what we're trying to do with Emily and her team, is review the accessibility over time and continuously make updates to improve it.
That's great. Thanks, Veronica. Emily, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I really just wanted to note that creating an accessible website is such an iterative process, and that it's not a process that happens overnight by any stretch of the imagination. And I've really appreciated learning about how to make the most of a piece of real estate online and make it as accessible as possible, but also recognizing that we live in a world where access needs conflict. And I mean, this happens offline too. You know, there are some people who benefit from having a dark, quiet room, and there are some people who prefer to have the lights on as much as possible so that they can see, right? So, you know, it's a constant balance of access needs and how do you make the most of the surroundings and the environment for everyone. So it's not something that there's easy answers to, but it's something that I think we are making progress towards, like, finding the right answers that serve the most people. So it's an interesting dilemma to have, and one that I don't know will ever go away, but one that I think is continuing to evolve.
Yeah, that's for sure. Thanks, Emily. Appreciate it. Just a quick reminder to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat if you don't feel like putting them in the Q&A, and we will get to them as soon as we can. Next quick section that we're going to go through, I'm going to talk about WCAG 2.2 and the pending 3, which will be coming around in the next couple of years. So first, let's talk about 2.2. And I think, Nicole, you can share some of the links that I'm going to talk about through here, right?
Yep.
Great, thank you. So as Veronica noted in 2.1, that's the current version, and there's 50 guidelines in there. And then 2.2, which is going to be released this summer, adds an additional 8 guidelines. And that has additional support for people with cognitive and learning disabilities and users with low vision, as well as users with disabilities using mobile devices. And so I'm just going to quickly go through some of these new guidelines across the 4 principles that Veronica covered. First, for instance, focus indicator must stand out for the background. So if you're like tabbing through a form, for instance, it should be very clear visually from using the tab to so that the background and the focus indicator are separate from one another visually. Electronic publications must have page numbers that are consistent between digital and print. So page numbering is a new guideline in 2.2. And then alternatives to dragging, for instance, such as tapping or clicking with your mouse are another guideline as part of this. And then interactive targets such as buttons should be at least 44 pixels wide and high, and can include surrounding white space. Help features should be consistent. They should be easily located by anybody and on consistent from page to page. Important controls should remain visible and available whenever they're relevant. So like if you're using tools and they disappear, that's not really helpful for anyone. So making sure that they're visible and available as they are relevant. And then things like cognitive login tests for things like logging in, if you have to answer a password or answer an authentication question or something like that. Having an alternative way to do it, such as copy and paste, is another guideline. And then finally, like auto-filling forms with previously entered information, then maybe the exception to that would be like confirming a password or abandoned forms, but otherwise supporting autofill for forms. So that's, those are the quick 8 guidelines for 2.2. Again, that comes out this summer. They're in addition to everything that's already there. And now I'm going to actually ask you to forget all of that because in 2023, 3 is going to come out with a whole, they've kind of completely rethunk this and redesigned the whole idea of web accessibility. And when I say forget about it, I don't mean don't use it. I just mean that there's a whole new way of looking at it on the horizon. One that to me I think is very exciting because it offers so many more opportunities to make more useful experiences across a wider range of assistive technology as well as a wider range of disabilities. So the first draft of the accessibility guidelines 3 was just released. I think it was a few weeks ago. So the name has been changed, so it's more than just content now. So the idea is that the Web W3C accessibility guidelines are broadening beyond just content. It's a new approach, so it's an alternative set of guidelines. So it's not really going to be backwards compatible with 2.2, and in fact, many folks are saying that it's probably going to be that 2.2 guidelines and 3-point guidelines are going to coexist with each other for some time because they are such a different way of approaching things. So one of the major differences in WCAG 3 is scoring. So the focus is on kind of reaching outcomes as opposed to simple pass-fail tests. So oftentimes when running usability and accessibility tests on individual pages, it's usually a pass or a fail. You either are accessible or you're not, kind of thing. And so this whole idea of a scoring system is going to make it easier to kind of figure out not everything is black and white, that there are shades of gray in there. And so a scoring system kind of replaces the A level, AA level, AAA level. And I think it's going to be 1 to 100 of the guidelines that I've read. It hasn't been really clear exactly on the numbering system that they're going to use. And then finally, you have the ability to receive medals based on your score. So a bronze medal, a silver medal, a gold medal. And so that'll be part of the guidelines. Now, I think another thing that is really interesting is that it's a shift from a page model to a product model. So, currently a lot of accessibility tools like WebAIM and Site Improve and stuff, they allow you to review a page and then you can kind of see exactly what the things are on that page. Whereas the scoring system is going to be for a full site or for a full product. And so the idea being that you're still going to do page to page, checks on accessibility features, but the product model helps you, the guidelines move beyond just kind of the simple pass fail. And so, for instance, like alt text is one of those things where, if you have 100 images on your site and 97 of them have alt text, but 3 don't, you typically fail. And so this scoring system allows for that kind of a little bit of flexibility there. And then, so there's 5 guidelines in the current draft, as I understand them. And again, these just came out in the last few weeks, so I've read through and done research, but I can't say I have memorized all of them by any stretch of the word. This is going to change. I mean, this is not going to be a recommended guideline until 2023. So these 5 guidelines will expand and certainly change and evolve as more and more people give input and more research is done. So tagging for image descriptions essentially remains the same. However, again, the scoring process makes it a little bit different. So the products will be scored based on the amount of alt tags, not a pass fail, as I mentioned before. Clear words, like so using common words to reduce confusion, improve understanding, and basically talking about how things are written. Again, not really too easy to give a pass fail on. And it was when the 2.2 guidelines were being put together, it was considered insufficiently testable. So using common words is a rating scale with flexible units of measure in version 3. Focused is primarily on emerging technologies. The captions, the guidelines haven't changed for kind of traditional captioning. The new focus for version 3 is on VR and augmented reality and such. Future drafts are going to consider more traditional captioning guidance, and W3C hopes that including this guideline will increase research in this area as well, since these are emerging technologies. And then structured content. So we've been talking about this at Mightybytes for a while, making sure that content has clear semantic structure that conveys hierarchy. So that's using section headers, using sections, headings, subheadings, et cetera, to clearly organize content in a way that makes sense. These guidelines will address a broader range of disabilities, both physical and cognitive. And then, one of the suggestions there is that headings should be visually distinct for sighted users. And there's a whole bunch more, and I'm going to share a link, or Nicole's going to share a link for me at the end of this to read through the entire all of the 3.0 guidelines. Visual contrast of text, which is the 5th of the 5 guidelines, has more based on current research on luminance contrast between the background and text. Has new calculations of contrast based on more modern research on color perception. And I think probably most exciting for most designers is it gives more choice in visual representation and such. So making sure that there's a lot more context in what can be considered visual context than the kind of pass-fail approach that there is now. And finally, W3C is looking for feedback on this. So there's the full guidelines, which will be linked in the chat. You can submit feedback. You have to log into their GitHub repository in order to do that, or there's an email address that we'll put in the chat as well that you can just submit comments to. So I highly recommend that you go through and read the full guidelines. There's a lot there. And then if you have suggestions on they very clearly outline what they're looking for feedback on. And so you have the ability to give clear feedback throughout the process as you review them. So I see looks like there might be some questions coming in the chat. So I'm gonna stop there with that very brief whirlwind overview of 3.0 and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, so I have a question here that asks, how or what e-commerce platforms exist that are ADA compliant? We use big e-commerce, and while things can change, there are things that we can control, all images, etc. It's not possible to have a commercial cart system like big e-commerce or Shopify to be changed. So if you manage a website like that sells online, what can you do?
Yeah, that is a big consideration. And I think probably the biggest thing is to advocate for BigCommerce, Shopify, Magento, any of the other online commerce platforms to make their tools more accessible. Our fellow B Corp EcoBags has an online shop for selling planet-friendly bags, canvas bags and stuff like that. And they got hit with a lawsuit, and they were using one of these e-commerce platforms. And the first thing that they did was reach out to the platform to say, hey, what am I supposed to do here? And they didn't really have any resources for them, which I found kind of surprising. Now, Mightybytes doesn't do a ton of e-commerce, so I'm not sure that, in terms of the specifics of e-commerce, that we are the best folks to provide guidelines or recommendations on that. But I think that advocating for the use of accessibility standards on the existing platforms is absolutely something that needs to happen, especially given that e-commerce is, I think it's like 30 to 40% rise in e-commerce in the last year because of COVID and stuff. So you think about that, and that's a huge, significant shift. I don't know, Emily, do you have any additional thoughts on this?
I would say this is also outside of my wheelhouse and expertise, but I'm actually now going to do my own research to learn more.
I might add, Tim, also, although I don't have an e-commerce solution for you, this brings up a bigger issue in that many of the platforms or plugins that exist now are not as accessible as we would want them to be. And part of this is because the web accessibility conversation is relatively new. I mean, really, it's started to gain ground in the last 4 to 5 years. And so developers from the past built platforms without accessibility in mind because it wasn't part of the common conversation. It's certainly gaining momentum now. But we are finding that even when we build a website for a client, when we want to use a plugin, for example, a calendar plugin, let's say they have events that they want to promote, it's very difficult to find WordPress plugins that are fully accessible. So again, there's that issue of the compromise in trying to balance your needs for functionality with the accessibility. And it's hoped that by having webinars like this, by having this conversation more and more often, that developers, regardless of platform, will start to consider accessibility more. And in 5 years from now, this won't even be a concern. But until then, unfortunately, no matter how much someone wants a site to be completely accessible, we are, as an industry, having to recognize that we're not there yet, and that every time we have a conversation or every time a client asks us for accessibility, that's the only way that people start to think, oh, this is important. This is something that we need to consider.
Veronica, I know we talked a little bit about this yesterday as we were preparing for this webinar. Do you have any thoughts on kind of bespoke solutions similar to what you were just saying versus kind of off-the-shelf solutions? I know that customizing off-the-shelf solutions is one thing, but in general, what are your thoughts on balancing those two? Because a lot of people tend to turn to either AI-powered or automated accessibility tools, to as kind of band-aids or quick fixes, and usually that's in response to a lawsuit or something. Do you have thoughts on why that might not be a bad or good approach, or whether it is?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I'm thinking. When it comes to wanting to build out a completely custom website, in an ideal world you would, but budget is going to be a major factor in that decision. And it's expensive to build something from scratch. And that's why so many people use an existing platform or some sort of open source content management system or what have you. So we can't pretend that budget isn't going to be a factor. But Tim, you mentioned this idea of some automated plugins and things that can help with accessibility. And there are tools out there for us. There's good and bad for them. So for example, in the case study I showed earlier, we built out an accessibility control drop-down where you could change the font and the contrast and so on. Now, there are tools out there where you can take them and put them on your site, and they will do that functionality for you, so you wouldn't have to pay a developer. Those come with their own problems. There's certainly some brands out there that have their own accessibility issues. However, the bigger concern for me is it's not going to fix the problem. You know, you being able to change the font size or the contrast on a site does not fix the accessibility issues within the code. And so this sort of quick fix mentality for accessibility is probably a little bit dangerous, because there are things that need to be built into the site with the code that you just can't sort of gloss over with one of these tools. Now, there's another set of tools out there for testing whether or not your site adheres to the WCAG guidelines. Now, we use one called Site Improve, but WebAIM is another popular one. There's several out there. Those are very helpful in terms of knowing whether or not you're ticking the boxes that you are passing, you know, the guidelines. However, even those can be misleading. And that's because even if your code technically adheres to the guidelines, it doesn't mean there aren't bugs in the website that a user with assistive technology wouldn't see. And so we always encourage, if you're able to get real users who on the day-to-day experience with the internet, they use assistive technology, we really encourage that in-person testing. Yeah. You know, if that's a friend, if that's a colleague, or you can even outsource that activity to organizations. And yes, there is a cost involved with a lot of that, but that's where you're really going to find the problems. And we've experienced it whenever we've tested with real users as well. We think our site is accessible, we think we're passing, and then all of a sudden someone with a screen reader informs us that they can't actually tab through the navigation. And so it's only with that real user testing that you find these issues crop up. So the tools are helpful, but they are certainly not the answer. And in some cases, as I mentioned, they can cause their own accessibility concerns.
Yeah, sure. Great, thank you for that. That's really, really helpful. I added a story I wrote for Be the Change on the EcoBags e-commerce example that I mentioned earlier, and so I put that in the chat. And, we'll continue to share any other links that come up. Nicole, were there any other questions for the rest of us to consider and ponder?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot of really awesome questions.
Oh, cool.
So one that I picked out here, does implementing WCAG AA compliance adversely affect the carbon footprint of the website?
That's a great question. And the answer is actually, typically accessible websites tend to be better performing, which means they have lower carbon footprints. They're accessible to more people, more technologies can use them, and they often tend to be lower in the amount of bandwidth that they use because of that. That being said, you know, the accessibility and sustainability go hand in hand, but they are two different things. And so, you know, if your goal is to create the most lightweight website possible, you want to talk about your performance budgeting, you want to talk about the data throughput of each of your pages, which could impact a person using the screen reader, for instance, if they happen to be in a low bandwidth area. So our recommendation is always to, you know, create as lightweight of a site as you can that works across the widest number of devices and platforms as possible. Veronica, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's good. Maybe the only thing I would add is typically the more accessible a site, the more best practices it includes for usability in general. So people won't have to keep clicking and then going back because they can't find what they're looking for, which helps with the sustainability as well.
Absolutely. Better for people, better for search engines, better for the planet.
Great. Thank you. And we have another question that says, given these changes, should folks be planning on major site updates in 2023? Why do they already have a WCAG 2.2 website? Are they going to become obsolete?
That's a good question as well. Emily, Veronica, I'll let you answer that first. I have some thoughts too, for sure, but I think we've been talking a lot about continuous improvement. So I think that's my answer would be around that. What do you think?
Personally, for me, I think you should continue from now to pursue web accessibility. I think although the way of scoring may change and the guidelines themselves may change, the concepts behind these guidelines is going to be the same. You know, it's not going to change so radically that including image alt text is going to become a bad thing. So the way the guidelines are written out now are certainly a good point to start from. And then, you know, come 2023 or whenever version 3 rolls around, you'll be in a good position to move forward with whatever those guidelines suggest. But what you do now will not harm your accessibility score come 2023.
Right. Emily, do you have any additional thoughts you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would also add that I think it's super important to be forward thinking if you have that capability now. I know that I'm in the process of a personal website redesign, and the designers are already thinking about how to ensure that they're meeting the standards of WCAG 3.0, but I recognize that that's not something that, you know, everyone is thinking about right now. And I'm very lucky that I'm in a position where I can be thinking about it. But if you can take the time to familiarize yourself with it now, it's probably going to save you some time later.
Sure. Yeah. And then over time, it just becomes kind of another set of things that you consider as you move along. You know, I mean, if people make, updates to websites, or should be making updates to websites on a pretty regular basis. And so, you know, just familiarizing yourself with the 58 guidelines that are there and just kind of keeping them in the back of mind as you go through the addition of content and new features and all the things that typically happen as you update a website over time, then it just becomes a natural part of your process and not this thing that exists over here that you have to think about every now and again. It's just literally built into the whole thing.
And I believe the draft of version 3 is available on the website.
Yep. Yeah. In fact,
Yeah,
we
that
put a
chat.
link to it in the chat. Nicole, you have another question?
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more. Can any of your organizations assist with ensuring site accessibility?
Well, I mean, I know the answer to that. That is yes. It's kind of what we do. So, you know, happy to help, of course. But yeah, I mean, we also blog about it. So you check out the Mightybytes blog. There's a full accessibility section where we talk about using the guidelines and how to kind of use them for your website and stuff.
Yep. And we have,
Let's do one more.
Okay. So I know that widgets came up earlier and that there are some associated issues, but are there any that could be useful to people who are trying to get into the practice of like making their websites more sustainable?
Veronica, I'll volley this one over to you.
To me, I prefer not to use widgets like for example, Accessibility is a popular one. It's got some accessibility issues, so I wouldn't recommend popping that onto your site and walking away. What I would recommend is using things like Chrome extensions to test your site, again, just to see if the code is accessible. You'll have to do real user testing, but my recommendations are Site Improve have a good free one, and WebAIM has a good free one. And then there are some other things out there like color contrast checkers. There are some paid for extensions as well that would let you simulate assistive technology. For example, it would let you simulate a screen reader. I don't love that idea just because if you aren't a regular user of a screen reader, you don't necessarily know how it all works, and you don't know sort of the shortcuts that someone might take, or the tricks that they can use to get the screen reader to do what they want. So simulators I would stay away from if possible, but in terms of just general scoring, some of those Chrome extensions are good.
Veronica, similar to that, have there been any good plugins that you've found as you've been working on some of these projects that are reliable? I know that you mentioned earlier there's events plugins tend to be really challenging when you're trying to adhere to a high level of accessibility. Are there any that you found that you're like, oh, this is really good and it's kept up to date and it's, it maintains standards and stuff?
Not that come to mind. Finding an accessible plugin that does everything you need it to do and is accessible throughout whatever functionality is performing is very tough.
Right.
So there isn't one that's jumped off the page to me as one that's amazing. We've typically had our developers make adjustments to make those plugins a bit more accessible. But I think it just depends on what the functionality is you want. Probably the simpler the functionality that the plugin is providing, more likely it will be accessible, but you'll still need to do your research and run tests just to see if it is accessible.
Right, and that's a great opportunity to point out that a redesign is probably the best and most opportune time to think about this, because it allows you to put accessibility concepts at the foundation of whatever it is that you're doing. Oftentimes, retrofitting your website, which some people do use these plugins to kind of do a band-aid fix on their website, is suboptimal. And so if you are planning a redesign of your website soon, make sure that you talk to whoever you're working with about what their accessibility strategy is, because that'll definitely shift. Sure. And I think that's it. We're actually 2 minutes over. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time. Emily, thanks for spending some time with us here at Mightybytes, and we appreciate it. Everybody, thank you for joining us. We've recorded this, and we will be posting this on our YouTube channel, and we'll share a link with everybody once that's live and ready to go. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us via Twitter, or we've got our Twitter handle right there, or via LinkedIn, or just fill out a form on our website, or give us a ring, whatever, many channels work. So thank you again, everybody. Appreciate it. And we will see you again next month.